Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. And what a full house. I was just telling Patricia, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I said to myself, when I was a student, I never woke up this early on a Saturday morning. So this is the beginning of, I think, the new generation of African leaders. So thank you to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be here today to be part of this important and inspiring event at the Oxford University Africa Society, the Pan-Africa Conference on Youth and Leadership in Africa. Let me begin by thanking the Oxford University Africa Society and some of its distinguished and eminent past leaders, like the Deputy Prime Minister. Actually, I must say that I'm very happy that I'm talking before him, because when he speaks, it will be the end of the conference today. So I was just thinking to myself, I'm so happy I'm doing this before you, Deputy Prime Minister, and all the other distinguished professors in the room, and the young students, because today actually it's mostly about youth leadership, and I think that you are one of the most important people that exist on the planet today for Africa. In this uncertain global and economic environment and political environment, there is a lot of good news for Africa. The winds are blowing well on Africa. The dark clouds that are hovering over Europe and over the United States and even over East Asia are not yet hovering over Africa. So there is a lot of good news coming from the continent. So I want to start with that first, because most of the time when we start talking about Africa, we go directly into the negatives and what we must and must not do. So let me start by taking some time to talk about what we have done well. Then I will say what you need to do, and that's going to be the most challenging part. But the good news is that we had an economic crisis, as you all know, a financial crisis, a food crisis, and a food crisis in 2008. Normally, after crises, Africa always comes out last. We struggle, we take 10, 8 years after everybody has recovered from the crisis to recover, even when the crisis doesn't start in Africa or is not directly affect Africa. However, this time around, when the crisis came, it interrupted 6 years of uninterrupted 6% growth in Africa, the longest period of above 6% growth that Africa has ever had. So we were actually on the rise. We were moving very fast. Long before the economists decided to recognize us, we were already rising. In 2009, our GDP fell to 1.3%. However, thanks to strong macroeconomic policies put in place prior to the crisis, growth in sub-Saharan Africa rebounded strongly in 2010. GDP in sub-Saharan Africa was estimated at about 4.8%, which was the third fastest growing region after the crisis. So this is 2010. Today, Africa is projected to grow at about 5.6%, 5.3% in 2012, and 5.6% in 2013. Africa will be the second only continent that is actually going to grow between 2012 and 2013. Africa could therefore recover its pre-crisis growth levels by 2015, that is 6%, which is the minimum we need to grow. Actually, we're happy that we're at 6%, but for most of us, because of our population rates, we need to grow much faster just to make up for the rising population growth rates that we have. Most of Africa is growing, but this is not limited. Most of the time when we talk about Africa growing, people say, yes, of course, Nigeria is growing, Angola is growing. These are the resource-rich countries. But this time around, it's not only the resource-rich countries that are growing. Even the non-resource-rich countries are growing. Over a third of the African countries are growing at about 6% in 2011, 2012. And another 40% are expected to grow at 4 to 6% in 2012. However, the uncertainty in the global growth makes Africa's growth vulnerable. Today, sub-Saharan Africa is one of two regions expected to increase its growth between 2012 and 2011. But while the growth forecast for the rest of the world is quite slow, even in East Asia, which is projected to grow, growth is dampening. China used to grow at 10%. It's growing at 8% now, nothing to shy away from. Many of us would like to grow at 8%. But that is a big dip for China, and that is going to have a big effect on Africa if it persists. The Eurozone is going to contract at about 0.3%. Many of you who live in Europe and in the UK send remittances back home. Many of our countries depend on 10, 20, and even 40% of remittances to grow. So if the dip in Europe continues, then we're going to see a lot of suffering in countries like Cape Verde, which is one of the countries that depends a lot. Tanzania, actually Kenya as well, depends a lot. And actually Nigeria, 10% of its GDP is remittances. So even Nigeria will be affected. However, generally, the fundamentals in Africa remain quite robust. Ghana is growing, Ethiopia is growing, Mozambique is growing, Angola is growing, Nigeria is growing, most of this at more than 8%. So there's a lot of good news in Africa, and we need to maintain that. Our leaders today need to continue to maintain that. The second piece of good news is you all, the youth of Africa. There is 1.2 billion youth, nearly 90% of the youth in the world today are from the developing countries. 8 out of 10 of those youth live in Africa or Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa today is home to about 200 million youth between the age of 12 and 24, and about 400 if you take that number to 35 years of age. The number of youth in the region will peak in about 20 years. This number is expected to grow a bit more in the next 20 years and then level out. Many people are concerned about this growing youth bulge, but as you also know, many people talk about the youth dividend and whether we can actually benefit from that in the continent if we put the right policies in place. So why is this youth bulge of benefit for us? For the first time in 2009, Africa's population surpassed 1 billion. Yesterday, we had the privilege to listen to the Deputy Prime Minister talk about the fact that to be a continent that can sit on the table and discuss reasonably with China, you need to have a big market. With 1 billion people, the market begins to become quite big, and it begins to become interesting for everybody. So this is the benefit of having that population number. But it also is a big burden. It's a big challenge, and it requires a lot of responsibility. And that is why you are part of the promise, but you are also part of the big challenge, and you must deliver the promise to yourselves as the youth of Africa tomorrow. In East Asia, we know that between 1965 and 1990, at least 25% of their growth was because of the youth bulge, because the youth were educated, because the youth were active in education, the youth were active in the population and provided the services. So you could be the potential and the reason why Africa's growth goes from 6% to 9% if you become as active as the East Asian youth were active between 1965 and 1990. But it will take good leadership to benefit from this dividend. We need good and deliberate leadership. We will have to develop leaders amongst your youth, and at the same time ensure that our youth are ready to contribute to society. That is why I entitled my talk, Expectations for a New Generation of Young African Leaders. History is upon us today. As I was writing this talk, I said, okay, well, normally when we write, we talk about the future, what one has to do for the future. But then I thought to myself, the future is here. We are the future. You all are the future. The Kwame Nkrumahs are no longer here. The Julius Nyereres are no longer here. It's us now. There's nobody else. There's no future. Otherwise, we have to wait many more generations. So rather than talking about the next generation of African leaders, of young African leaders, I said the new generation of young African leaders, because you are the new generation of young African leaders. And so the challenge and the big responsibility you have on your shoulders is for you to deliver this promise that we all expect from ourselves and from you. James Burns, a leading scholar and an internationally renowned authority on leadership studies, said leadership is one of the most observed and least understood phenomena. If you talk to, I'm sure if I ask everybody in the room what they understand by leadership, everybody will have a different answer, and they will be probably correct. Leadership theory is a growing field in social sciences. Many of the firms you work in or hope to work in pay a lot of money for leadership courses, building, creating, nurturing, discovering leaders. All over the place, they're leaders. In Africa, we have leadership workshops every weekend. I think you can count them every other day. We know and we realize that we need leaders. And the concept has evolved over time from a concept where leadership was about the great one, the illustrious one, Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, maybe Churchill, since I'm here, I have to say, Julius Nyerere. So it was all about individual performance. Then at a particular point in time, people began to realize that it was just not about the person. It was about an idea. It was about a vision that somebody will have. So it was about whether people could rise up to a challenge and do something. But then as we began to look at those kinds of leaders, I think the specialists in leadership started realizing that there were two kinds of leaders, what you call transactional leaders and transformational leaders. The transactional leader is one who leads by contract. He contracts in exchange for a reward or for an effort. Such leaders focus on satisfying self-interests of their subordinates, a small group they are beholden to. In our cases, and you will be very familiar with that, if you call a leader, we have a foreign nation that he's beholden to whom he has a contract with. He has maybe an ethnic group. He has maybe a religious group. We spoke about that yesterday. He has a military faction, he has a religious faction, he has an economic base, and with all these little differences, he has a transaction with them. Those are the set of transactional leaders. They come into power, we usually say, because he was supported by that faction, or because he was supported by that faction. There is no vision in these leaders. On the other side of the transactional leader, you have the transformational leader. The strength of the transformational leader is their vision, their personality, their ability to bring people together, to change ideas, to inspire people to move. They are people who have perceptions and motivations and work towards common goals. They try to make sure that everybody is together and moving towards the same direction. And I think this will resonate again with some of us who were listening to the Deputy Prime Minister last night. Unlike the transactional leader, the relationship with the transformational leader is based on the leader's intellect, his personality, traits and ability to change one's life and one's vision through his goals and ideals. The question for us today is, what does Africa, what do we need to do to develop a cadre of transformational leaders and to nurture those who exist? Because it's very important. I think a lot of times we're looking for the new leaders, but they are young leaders in front of us that we do not nurture. And we spend a lot of time looking for new ones. So we need to take the time to nurture those that exist. Now let me go into, I'm getting into sort of the second part of my talk, which is giving us a sense of what is leadership, where are we going, and why do we need leadership today? In 2011, there were 16 elections in Africa. 10 of those elections brought incumbent presidents to power. I will not name their names, but as I read the countries out, you will understand. Central African Republic, Uganda, Benin, Djibouti, Chad, Seychelles, Cameroon, the Gambia, DRC, I saved the best for last. We're all re-elected leaders, and of course Liberia with a woman, and I'll come back to the gender dimension of leadership later. 5 countries gave us new presidents. Niger, I debated about this one, but Nigeria, I consider them a new president. I debated about it because he was a temporary transitional leader for a while, so he was not an elected leader, so he got elected in 2011. Sao Tome and Principe. Cape Verde, of course, they won the Mo Ibrahim Prize. The outgoing leader won the Mo Ibrahim Prize for good governance. And Zambia. Those were the 5 countries that gave us new leaders. Africa could probably do better. On average, of the 10 presidents that were re-elected, they had been in power for over 20 years. Of course, there are some outliers that skew the average, but 20 years is a long time. And Deputy Prime Minister and a few others are wondering. South Sudan was the good news. We got a new country, at least last year. This year we are debating about it. And just to digress a little bit, when we think of South Sudan, I always wonder whether Africa should be fragmenting or uniting, and whether that was the right way to go. But we will come back to that leadership discussion around fragility later. But if we take, so when we look at 2011, it's not so great. When we look at 2012, it's actually looking like it's getting worse, because we've only had, actually we have not had, we're supposed to have had 3 elections. In Guinea-Bissau, we have a crisis, we have a coup d'etat, we actually don't know who is running the country. We know that it's a group of military factions, but there's no face to that. In Mali, there was supposed to be an election on the 21st of April. We were hoping that we would get a reasonably democratic leader who has decided to leave and get a new election. That is not happening, as you all know. But we have Senegal. And Senegal is your story, because Senegal is the story, again, of youth. The youth had the courage today, the courage to challenge, and the courage to ask, why not? And in Senegal, we have now transformational leadership. But that was because the youth decided that they wanted that change. So you are already doing things, I think. So this is not a new beginning, I think, for the youth of Africa. This is a continuation. And this was the same, actually, with the elections in Nigeria as well, where the youth were very active and created internet sites where they were having debates and discussion. So this is, I think, what we're doing here today is really beginning to solidify, as Idris said, a movement that has started, but that needs a lot more wind in its sails to make sure that it persists and is sustained. And as I discussed in the beginning, our current leadership has done well on the transactional side. We are growing, but our growth is almost accidental, not inclusive, and always in danger of being derailed by the next ambitious and transactional leader. As a matter of fact, that's what's happening, I think, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. We saw a little bit of that last year, and in Guinea-Bissau. Because if you rule by factions, then chances are many more factions are discontent. Now, if you rule by factions, but you're also growing, it means you're getting richer, but very few people are getting richer, which means the factions of discontent increase. So it is even more important now as we grow and as we begin to enter a stable environment that our leadership gets better. Because the more we grow and the more we create fragmented societies and the more there is inequality, the higher the chances that we will fall back into the Africa of the 80s, which is an Africa of strife, of civil conflict, and of fragmentation and fragility. So it is even more important. Growth now is the challenge of leadership, because as we continue to grow, then we will create more discontent because the growth is not equitable, and we will have more civil strife. So this is your challenge again, is to make sure that that growth is inclusive. The importance of high quality political leadership cannot be overstated. Even in Europe, you see it. There's big debates about who can lead, who can get us out of the crisis, who can take the right direction. Is it austerity? Is it growth? And how should we do it? So it is a continuous challenge. We are never going to get to the point where we say we've arrived. There's enough leadership that we can stop. It is a continuous formation, and we need to keep talking to each other about it. And I think we have good examples in Africa and in Asia about this. And let me give you one example, which is always used, I think. But I think people always stop the story before they get to the end. And this is the famous example of Ghana and South Korea. We all know that in 1980, they had about the same GDP per capita of $490. Actually, Ghana was slightly higher at 491, if one wants to be precise, in 1957. But by the early 80s, Ghana's annual per capita income had fallen from 491 to 400, while South Korea's GDP per capita was $2,000. So we went from being 491 and they 490 to them going up to $2,000. And Ghana, I say we because I guess we are all together in this story, at $2,000. But then when you think about who was Africa's president, who was Ghana's president in 1957? I think we will all say that it was a transformational leader. It was Kwame Nkrumah. When we talk about who was South Korea's president in the 1950s and 60s, it was President Park. He's celebrated as somebody who opened South Korea, who gave them a better society, export orientation, who made sure that growth was inclusive. But I think that one of the things, as I was doing this yesterday, I started thinking, is we never thought of the different cycles of how political leadership gets built. Because when we look at President Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's president from 1957 to 1966, he was an exemplary leader, I believe. He was one of Africa's early transformative leaders. So this comparison, and I will show you, sometimes is misguided because it gives us a sense that he was not good enough and he was not able to lift Ghana out. But unlike South Korea, he still needed to create a vision for Ghana. And what he was not able to do was create a vision and economic prosperity at the same time. And I think that we should continue to celebrate him for him creating that vision, working with the Ghanaians to create the vision and to be transformational. And as he was doing that, it was an interruption in the process of creating a vision that slowed Ghana's GDP. So if you look at the GDP of Ghana and South Korea during the period when he was president, it was actually growing. It was not growing as fast as South Korea's, but it was growing. So again, this is statistics. So when I give you the statistics and I say 57, it was the same, 80, it was different, you should say in between, there was a coup d'etat. In between, there was a transition and a transactional leader came to power. The Ghanaians lost their transformational leader, and he had not had the time to create a vision that was sustainable. And that is the story of Ghana. Not that Ghana and South Korea diverged so badly because Ghana could not make it. What did Kwame Nkrumah do? And I'm going to go a little bit through what Kwame Nkrumah did because I think he is an example of the kind of leadership that we could be. And many of us are sitting in Oxford today, and half of the room is probably MBAs or finance grads. So the business part of it, I think you will get, and I'll talk about it very quickly. But because I started my speech by saying we are growing, Africa's growing economically, we have foreign direct investment, I think we have the business done, or we're getting there. What we're still lacking enormously is the leadership part. One of the big things that Kwame Nkrumah did was to have a vision for Ghana. He made the case for independence. He traveled across Ghana, making his case to community after community, beating the pavements, like they would say, that the Gold Coast needed self-government. He wanted independence. On the basis of the community-to-community travel, he was able to build a large base of support towards the cause of self-determination. Many rushed to his cause, the cocoa farmers, the women, everybody. He didn't have any transactional arrangement. He had universal suffrage behind him. So by 1949, he had such a diverse group behind him that it was difficult to break it. And that is how he was able to, with the convention of the People's Party, obtain independence for Ghana. So he had a vision. His vision was independence for Ghana. And he worked not through transactional leadership, not through getting support of one faction of the country against the other faction, not through getting support of one faction of the international community against another faction of the international community. He worked across the board to sell his vision, to convince people it was the right vision, and then he did it. And that is what we have to learn from Kwame Nkrumah. His vision was to educate, and this was important. He began to teach people that they could learn, and this is actually at the same time he was doing this, which is very interesting because many of us learn about the importance of education and how South Korea made it today because they invested in education. Kwame Nkrumah invested in education as well. He started doing the same things, which is why during his time, Ghana was growing almost the same pace. But that was interrupted in 1966, and his vision ended. Another leader with a vision, everyone agrees, from South Africa, Madiba. He had a vision. Minority South Africans were able to dream because he wanted a world without apartheid. Everybody, actually, not just minority South Africans, because his dream transcended South Africa into the United States. But to be a leader, the vision of Mandela is very well known and documented. But I think one of the things we do not know is that to be a leader, you have to take risks. And you have to be convincing when you take those risks, because that's the only way that you keep your coalitions together. And to be able to take risk and keep those coalitions together, you must be able to explain, to persuade, to encourage. Leadership is not dictatorship. Leadership is not commanding people into action. It is having the ability to persuade. Now that we're sitting in a university, you must have the data and the facts. The Deputy Prime Minister will say that we do not want to do too many feasibility studies, but we need a few facts and numbers to convince people. Mandela surprised most people with his decision when he decided that he was going to negotiate. A lot of people thought no. He had principles, and he said, I have a vision. My focus is to end apartheid. If it needs negotiation, I will do that. The history books say that a lot of his party did not agree with him, but he was able to convince them, and he took the time to convince them that that was the right thing to do. And the test of true leadership is not to say, because you don't agree with me in the middle of the road, I'm going to leave you alone. It's to continue talking, and we must do that as leaders if we want to be good leaders. He spent 4 years in his negotiation process, negotiating. And during that period, not only was he negotiating, he was also negotiating within the ANC, because for 4 years, the ANC was saying, you should not negotiate. We told you not to negotiate. It's the wrong thing to do. But he said, the problem is not me talking to them. The problem is them giving us what we want. We have a vision. And part of getting that vision is to discuss and to negotiate, so I will do that. And this is the difficult part, because leadership also means that you could be alone when you take difficult decisions. But if you're convinced and if you have a vision and you continue to remind people of the vision, you will keep your leaders and your followers together. The fourth quality of leadership is also, and this is what one flows from the other, is how you select the people around you. Who is part of your society? The Africa-Oxford Society, for example. We have many societies now. How do we pick our partners? How do we pick the people who belong to those societies? Are they our friends? Or are they people who believe in the vision with us? This is very important, because increasingly we create a lot of the societies around Africa, for Africa, about Africa, but they are not really around competent people. Maybe there is one competent person, but if you're one competent person with sub-competent people around you, without realizing it, it becomes transactional and you become a dictator. If you create a community of core competence, then people dare to challenge you. And this is why today when you look at the ANC, we still have people who are ministers of finance and this and Trevor Manuel, and you have good, strong, powerful people coming out of there over and over again. So yes, there was one strong leader, but there were many others right beside Madiba who were just as strong and just as convincing. And that is what allows sustainability, because when one person goes, the vision does not die. When one person goes, the vision continues, and this is what we have to do. So yesterday we were talking about, for example, the Africa-Oxford Society, and there was a discussion about how it had gone down over the years because the leadership had wavered, and then it had sort of come back. But it means that the leadership and the association of the Oxford Society, you need to strengthen, and you need to make sure that there is a vision that can sustain even when one or two people leave, or even when there are differences in factions. In Africa, when we talk about building a good team, many people say, well, you can't build a good team. You can't find a country that's built a good team or that has built good institutions. But we have Botswana, we have Cape Verde. So we have good examples of these institutions around us. So we don't need to go look at the Malaysias of the world to understand that building institutions are important or that you can do them. We have many of them around us. We have institutions like the Oxford Society. I just said that I know that it wavered, but it has been here for decades now, right? So it means we can sustain them, we can build them. So at the national level, we have these institutions. At the individual level, we have these institutions. So we need to continue to build that. So Africa has gone from this period of great leaders, I've just named a few, a transition where we had transactional leaders that made us grow, but we couldn't really call them transformational leaders. They didn't give us a vision. And then now we're with you. We're with us. And the question is, are we going to be 50 years from now when somebody else stands here, characterizes the next round of globalized transactional leaders? Because now the transactions get to Asia, and in Latin America, we're now doing business with the BRICS. So it's a much bigger transactional base, and we can do it effectively because we've shown that we can. The question is, can we merge the transactional capacity with the transformational capacity? And I believe that we can. But the path to leadership will not be full of recognition. It will not be full of rewards. On the contrary, they're going to be dark days, they're going to be lonely days, critical decision days. Many of the youth today are in a hurry. They want to get recognized as the next leader. They want to win the next leadership award. So we have so many young leaders. But the sum of our young leaders doesn't seem to be adding up. We need to be able to pull them together. We need to have more Senegals. We need to have more Nigerians. We need to have a lot more youth working together towards that shared vision. And one of the first things I was thinking about when I was doing this was I said to myself, what is the legacy? The way we do this is to say, what does the Oxford Society want as the legacy, as the vision for Africa? What does Africa 2.0, which I am a member of, want as a vision for Africa? What does the African Leadership Network want for Africa? We need to begin to create that vision. We need to begin to create that brand. We need to have discussions between all these different groups, the Africa Oxford Society, the Africa 2.0, to come to a shared vision, because we each have individual meetings and discussions about the same vision, but it's not clear that we have the same vision. And now we need to, I think there's enough critical mass that what we need is not another proliferation of societies and forums and discussions. It is a discussion amongst ourselves of what is that vision that we're looking for. And I think this is, for me, going to be the first test of what the Africa vision and the youth leadership from Africa is. You need a brand. We need a brand that is ours and that is shared. And the Prime Minister will recognize this thoughts. Some of us are frustrated with the status quo. Some of us want radical change. We've seen that radical change does not work. Radical change, we've seen the youth in South Africa try radical change. It doesn't always work. We've seen the youth in Cote d'Ivoire try radical change. It does not work. It is going to take patience. We've seen the youth in Senegal try change with patience. They were on the streets alternatively from September to the end of February. And they did get what they wanted without excessive violence, but with a shared vision. They had one thing: we have had enough, was what we need change. And there was every youth in Senegal had the same message for 8 months: we need change. It wasn't, we need this, we need that. There were 14 presidential candidates. They were not arguing about which candidate they were supporting. They were agreed and focused on the goal: we need change. And I think this kind of discipline is a discipline that we must acquire. We have, but we must demonstrate it. Unfortunately, today, going to Oxford, Cambridge, the University of Ghana, University of South Africa, does not make any of us a leader. In the past, you just needed, well, I say just, but you could go fight a war and be George Washington and automatically be a leader. You could go fight a war and be Genghis Khan and be a leader. All you needed to do was win your troops, and you got the title of a great leader. That's no longer the case. You have to win mentally. You have to win with the power of conviction. So it's a much more difficult task. Probably that's why we talk about it more often. But it is much more difficult. But I think if we can do it, it is also much more sustainable. So this is, I think, what we have to do now, is to decide how do we define the vision, how do we do the sustainability. Many of I talked about our organizations. One of the things that we learned when President Obama became President of the United States, for the first 3 months, there was a big discussion about the team of rivals and who was he going to put in his cabinet. And he put somebody who ran against him, Hillary Clinton. He put somebody from the Republican Party, General Jim Jones, and a few others. And Abraham Lincoln, the person who started abolition and the Civil War, did the same. He had 3 members of his cabinet that ran against him as president. This is the kind of courage that our leaders need to have to bring us together. And I think we begin to see that in Africa. What they're trying to do now is not that they bring the opposition together. They have this interesting government of national unity discussion. This is not a team of rivals. This is a team of destruction. It's a team of life support. We need a different kind of team of rivals, and we have them. But first of all, we have to go through the process of having the vision, agreeing that there was an election, agreeing that somebody is the leader, and then that person has to have the courage to bring in the best. Not his friends, not his family, but the best, even if the best come from the other side. And I think this is the lesson that we still need to learn. We haven't gotten there yet. And it comes down to our societies as well, as I mentioned before. We need to get there, to the point where we can reach out to people that are our competitors, that maybe we think will overshine us, but are as good enough. Because together you will be stronger. Alone you cannot do it. We cannot do it. And one of the reasons why you need these kinds of teams of rivals and the best is because our institutions are still fragile. We haven't had growth for long enough. We haven't built these institutions long enough. Even in Senegal, where the elections appeared to be so seamless in the end, the institutions, the electoral institutions, are still very fragile. How many, when we look at Africa today, I think all of us have electoral codes. All of us have electoral commissions. Not many of them have passed the test of time. Most of them are still very, very fragile. So we need the time to build those institutions. And one of the best ways of doing that is to have an inclusive and competent government doing it, with clear goals, clear ideals, and a clear vision that we want to make it clean. And I think that is the big challenge for us is to say, and we are part of it, one of the things that we should do is when these leaders, when our leaders, young and the existing transactional ones, pick the right person, we need to be able to support them. We need to be part of the transformation and not part of the transactions process. This is our first piece of work that we have to do is if you're in Kenya, you need to decide, is this the right decision? Not, is this what is good for where I'm coming from? Because if you do that, then you are also part of the transactional problem. So it's not just the leader who does the transaction. It takes two to tango. So he can't do it alone. So part of it is you being a transformational leader, but the other part of it is being a follower and being a transformational follower, not a transactional follower. So not all of us will be leaders. Some of us have to be followers, but we also have to decide, are we going to be transformational followers or transactional followers? And there's more followers. So by definition, you have more power. So you have to decide as well how you want to use that power. You have a lot of power, but you must decide how you want to use it. So that's good because I'm about to conclude. So I think what I've tried to do today is to show you that we've gone through a cycle on the continent and we continue to go through that cycle. We started off with transformational leaders, but they didn't have the benefit of strong institutions. They didn't have the benefit of resources. They didn't have the benefit of maybe the ideals and the intellect that we have today academically, but they had a vision. They had a vision of where they wanted to take the continent. Many of them didn't have enough time to continue and see the vision through because there was dislocation in the process. Then we got a series of transactional leaders. And those transactional leaders, some of them, and actually most of them, did us good. They took us out of an economic crisis. They took us out of the Africa that was starving and the Africa that was dying and the Africa that was conflict. They made a lot of transactional deals. But now we have rich growth, we have economic growth, we have increasing stability, there's less fragility on the continent. So we need to go back. We need to get back to being transformational. But then it's us. There are no more leaders ahead of us. It is our time to decide what we want to do, how we want to do it, and how quickly we want to do it. So I leave that with you today as the challenge of our generation of African leaders. Thank you very much.